Food was good, right? Yeah, there's a few last minute people coming in. Can I get you to grab the doors behind you just because it's a little loud in the hall? Someone want to grab the doors for me, please? Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Melody Lay. I manage the pen test team for the Government of Ontario in Toronto, Canada. But I'm really just here to introduce our next speaker. This is Andrew Jamieson, and he's going to be talking about Biohazard, Biometric Security. So, Andrew, please take it away.
Hello, is this on? Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I can't hear the speaker, so I'm going to assume, oh, there we go. I can hear it kick in now. Okay, thank you all for coming. Straight after lunch, I realize that, you know, I'm in the death zone here, so I will try and keep everybody awake during my presentation. I'll try and make it as exciting as security presentations can be. But beforehand, hands up everybody who is excited to be at AusCERT. I want to get a picture here. Everybody? Everybody? There we go. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. So, I work in UL. I've done a whole heap of stuff over the course of my working life. I've worked in payments, I've worked in cryptography, I've worked in embedded security, I have worked in creating standards, I've worked in working against standards. At the moment, I'm doing some stuff with biometrics. I'm going to talk to you about biometrics, talk to you about the problems with biometrics and also the potential solutions that they pose as well. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to appear negative. So I want to get out the front right away and let you know that I'm actually a big proponent of biometrics. I think when used in the right context, they can be a good thing. So Dickens, everybody loves Dickens, you know, from A Christmas Carol. Passwords were dead to begin with. Passwords have been broken since they were invented and used in computers in the 1960s at MIT. Back then, they used to go and print out the password file so that people could use the passwords from other people to get time sharing. Passwords broken. They've been increasingly broken as computers have got more advanced and we've found more vulnerabilities. Biometrics are also kind of broken, but there are ways we can fix that. And I think, once again, they can be used for good. So, I've mentioned a little bit about who I am. I won't go round the whole room and ask everybody to introduce themselves because that's probably not enough time for that. But how do we determine who people are? How do we know who somebody is? How do you know that I am Andrew Jamieson? I've introduced myself as Andrew Jamieson. I was introduced beforehand as Andrew Jamieson. You're essentially taking my word for that. What's that based on? How do you know? Are these actually, you know, people working together, as you might believe? This was taken at the Rugby Sevens in Hong Kong a couple of months ago. It was quite funny. So how do we define how we authenticate and identify people? Generally in computers, we talk about three factors. Those three factors being what you know, what you are, and what you have. So three factors of biometrics. At the moment, sorry, three factors of authentication. What we're going to talk about is what you are. Biometrics, fingerprints, these sorts of things. There's lots of them. And there's lots of technology vendors who will sell different types of biometrics. Obviously, fingerprints have taken off to a large extent because of consumer devices. If I was here a number of years ago talking about biometric security and saying, you know what, there's going to be hundreds of millions of people who use biometrics on their consumer device every day, you would have thought I was crazy. And often when I had this conversation, people would say, you know what, consumers will never accept it. What about people who have problems with, you know, hands and fingers? What about people who don't want to give away that information? How are we going to store it securely? How is it going to be managed? Nobody's going to accept that. And yet, now, many people choose to unlock their phones, their personal devices, their computers with their fingerprint. It's very common these days. But there are other forms of biometrics, and The attentive amongst you in the audience might notice that these are different colors. They do come across on the projector there. And that's because there's essentially 3 different types of biometrics that we look at. There's physical things, hand geometry, fingerprints, facial geometry, these sorts of things. They're affected by our biology, but essentially we're measuring a physical thing. There's also biological, DNA. Everybody sitting in this room is leaving their DNA to some extent around. Odor. As I stand on this stage, I'm leaving my odor on this stage. So you'll be very welcome that you're standing at the back there. There's behavioral biometrics as well. Things you can do. Your signature is something you can do. The way you walk is something that you do. The way you type, the way your voice works. These are affected by your physiology, but they're essentially things you do. So how do we manage biometrics? How do we work with it? Essentially, we're taking something that is innately analog and we're converting it into digital. Be they through pictures, through sound recordings, many different ways that we do it. We're taking analog, we're turning it into a digital thing at varying degrees of resolution. Some of it bad, some of it good. That resolution is really important. The process then is one of collection, processing that information, and then storing that information for enrollment. All biometric symptoms, all biometric systems have an enrollment process where they take the data and then they store the data. Basically, it is collected multiple times. Because you're taking an analog thing, analog things get in the way. The real world is not perfect. So the way you look, the way you move your face, the way your finger is positioned, all of these affect the biometric storage. And so you have to take multiple instances of collection to eventually process it, and you form what's called a template. This template is essentially what you will then match against for the biometric. You take that template, you store that template for later use. That's your enrollment process. Your identification process then is taking one capture, generally, of somebody, taking that analog thing, digitizing it, and then you compare that against your stored template. Does it match? Does it not match? And that match, once again, because we're working with physical analog things, that match is never going to be perfect. We're not comparing two numbers. We're comparing the way something looks, the way it walks, the way it moves. So you need to have some error in there. So things need to vary, and that comparison needs to take account of that. And that's where you get things like false match rates and false rejection rates. It's also important to understand that what we're doing here is an identification process. Quite often in biometrics, I find people confusing identification with authentication. What's the difference there? Your DNA identifies you. You all have unique DNA unless you have an identical twin. That DNA identifies who you are. It says nothing about your intent to do something. If the police find your DNA at a criminal scene, they don't say, ha, that guy must be the murderer, or that woman must be the murderer. No, they need to establish intent. They need to establish why, if you were there, would you choose to do the criminal act that was committed. Quite often with biometrics, we take identification and we say, aha, therefore they want to do something. Unfortunately, we need to link those two together a little bit better. So what could possibly go wrong with biometrics? What is the worst possible scenario here? How do biometrics not work? Why do they not work? If we're all individuals, we're all different, we can identify each other as individuals, what can go wrong? First of all, projectors. Projectors can often go wrong. I'm going to skip over this one. So that was a snowflake. Unfortunately, despite what your parents told you, you're not a unique snowflake. You are not perfect and unique and wonderful in the world. Everybody has similarities to other people. In DNA, I mentioned, you can have an identical twin. Your voice can sound different. Your features can look different. Your fingerprint patterns can be similar. The way you walk can be similar. So biometrics are not a one-to-one match. They're essentially a one-to-many match, because we've got to have those error bars in there. Because we're taking from the analog world, moving into the digital world, we don't get a unique, perfect number each time. We need to add error to it. So we take one template, and that template will match multiple people, because that's how it works. Interestingly, does this mean that we can take some features from multiple people and essentially create skeleton keys, essentially create features that we could use to unlock every different device, every different function that is protected by biometrics? Well, you can, ultimately. Some research done where they took fingerprint recognition systems and they managed to devise a method to basically create dictionary attacks against biometric systems, fingerprints, by creating fingerprint systems, false fingerprints. Presentation attack is a term that they could then apply from 100 to any system that they came across. So you can create biometric skeleton keys, systems that you can use against anything that's protected. Now, I mentioned false match rate and false rejection ratio. Essentially what that means is, because you've got these error bars in your system, you need to decide when you're going to say, you know what, it's not close enough, I'm going to reject that match. Or you say, you know what, it's close enough, it's not perfect, but it's okay, so I'm going to accept it. Now, if you do that incorrectly, if you reject somebody who is actually the owner, the person from which who enrolled in that process of the biometric, that is a false rejection. You're rejecting somebody who should be accepted. If you accept somebody who isn't the enrolled person, that's a false match. Now, unfortunately, as well as those error bars in the system, you also have the processing algorithms. And these processing algorithms increasingly are being driven by artificially intelligent systems. Now, artificially intelligent buzzword means lots of things. What it does mean is, sometimes we're not really sure how exactly they're working. Or at least, let me put it this way, they don't work like we think normally when we match a face. So further research done, they determined that in certain facial recognition systems, they could create glasses with patterns on that basically forced the image recognition system to match a false face. Put those glasses on, then you suddenly become beautiful. I wish I had some myself. This is a clear case of a false match by putting those glasses on. Now, who travels often here internationally? A few people, okay. So you go through the smart gates in Australia or different places. Imagine if you had somebody else's passport. I know you're supposed to take the glasses off, but let's say you put on special glasses and you can then get through that smart gate appearing as somebody else with somebody else's passport. It's possible, it's feasible. Now, it works the same way, or it works the opposite way when it comes to false matching or false rejection. You can have systems where the correct person, for whatever reason, doesn't really get matched. Now, why is that? Once again, it depends on the system, depends how it's matching. You can look at these pictures and you can say, well, they look close enough. Some of them are a little bit different. It depends on how the biometric processing works. There's a lot of factors. When it came to this particular system that we were testing, it was mainly based on resolution. If the resolution wasn't the same, it would reject the picture, or at least it would have a higher percentage chance of rejecting the picture. Now, seems obvious. You have two pictures, different resolution, hard to match. Are these two very handsome fellows the same person? Well, one has a beard, one doesn't have a beard. They both have very manly eyebrows, but it's very hard to tell. If we lived in the Blade Runner universe, we could just say that magic word of enhance, and then it would become more clear. So the resolution is really quite important. Maybe, I don't know. They still look different to me. So biometric security then essentially is limited by the quality of the analog capture, the digital processing that is performed, and the security of that digital processing, and the report output. Because if you can manipulate the report output, everything before that is of no value. Doesn't matter if the biometric system is perfect. If it provides a report saying that's not the person, but you can change that to say, yes, that's the person, then you have violated the biometric system. But is that true? Is that really true? Are these really the factors? Are they fundamental? Is there anything we can do to change these things? There's some research done by Google engineers, which was really quite interesting, on pictures. Now, believe it or not, these are pictures of faces. They don't really look like faces because they've been deliberately pixelized. They're 8 by 8 grid of pixels. They fed this into a system, and they said, you know what, my wonderful artificially intelligent system, these things here are pictures of faces. You've got a huge database of faces. You figure it out. Make these pictures better. In the Blade Runner universe, enhance. And this is what it came out with. From that, this was the input, make it better, enhance, suddenly faces appear. Now, fair enough, you might say, you know what? They're faces, of course, but you know, you could give it a single pixel, tell it's a face, and it could just pick somebody's face and say, there you go, it looks like that. That was the input. That was the original input on this side that was then pixelated, the middle row being what the computer generated. It's pretty close. So maybe in biometric systems, we can enhance. We can take resolutions and make them better. But you know what? If we're doing that, we're adding new error bars. We're making things up, essentially. We're taking data that is based on millions of data points out in the real world, and we're trying to fit that into what we've got. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I expect to see more of this. So that's based on big data. How else does big data influence biometrics? How else can we take these biometric systems that are used, and how else can we manipulate that data or use that data in different ways? Who here has a fitness tracker, Fitbit, Apple Watch, Android Wear, something like that, something like this? I got one on myself. They're great things. And I expect to see these come up more and more. That data can be used in different ways. So in some good ways, this was a good case where they could use that data to show that somebody was attacked. It was then valid in a court of law, because increasingly, this fitness data is going to be asked for. Think about it. If you've got one of these things, it's recording your heart rate, it's recording your location, it's got information about your resting heartbeat, it's recording where you are at any particular time. That's certainly very useful information. Is that information you want to give out to other people? It's been used to help with arrests. So a case, unfortunately, where a man murdered his wife, not very good, but then he was convicted based on fitness tracking data. Because they found from that data, he said a criminal came in, broke into the house, murdered his wife, but the tracker recorded his wife moving around the house after he said that she was murdered by this criminal. Now, if you wanted to manipulate this, when I read this, I put my hacking hat on, and I think, aha, I could give my tracker to somebody else, and I could pretend that other person was me while they were somewhere else, so I could then go and commit a crime, and I could use that as an alibi. Once again, it's got information about you. It knows my resting heart rate. I would have to find somebody who has a similar resting heart rate. It knows what my general gait is, how far I walk over a given amount of time. I'd need to find somebody who had that as well. Other data, other biometric data that is increasingly being looked at. Pacemakers, once again, record information about your heartbeats, record information about you being uploaded somewhere, can be used in a court of law. If you have a pacemaker and you commit a crime, as this person did, they can examine that pacemaker data and then determine levels of stress. Let's say, in this case, the person committed arson. You said, you know what, I was at home relaxing at that time. Get your pacemaker data, your heart rate's really high because you're actually setting somewhere on fire, doesn't corroborate your story. So this data is important, and we're increasingly giving it away. Once again, I asked before, who's traveled? I travel quite a lot. My biometric data is everywhere. My fingerprint data is in the US, it's in Japan, it's in Singapore, because I hand that over. I have to hand that over to get into the country. How do they store that data? I don't know. How are they using that data? I don't know. I have to give it away because otherwise I can't get into the country. How is it going to be used in the future? Once again, I don't know. Now, the talk just before this, somebody talked extensively about phone banking systems and voice recognition systems. Certain banks have voice recognition systems that detect, you say, my voice is my password. I'm sure everybody's just recorded that, and now you can get into my banking system. The BBC ran a test against these things. Two people, they're actually twins, but non-identical twins. He got his brother to phone up, got into his system. They're not perfect. They've got error bars on them. Biometrics in and of themselves, although great, are flawed because they're comparing analog systems, and analog systems vary over time. So fingerprints. Talked about fingerprints. I got everybody to raise their hand, and I took a photo of them, and I'll be using that later on. If you have a good photo of somebody's fingerprints, you can use that to generate a fake finger and then use that to unlock biometric systems. So it was talked about previously. There was Chaos Computer Club, I think, in Germany. Took Merkel's fingerprint, opened their system. Now, interestingly, they then said, haha, we're going to get her iris print next. And 2 years later, they had her iris print. Because cameras are great, and they're increasing in their quality and decreasing in price. You can buy a really great camera with a huge zoom these days for essentially a pittance. With that camera, you can take people's fingerprints from a long way away. You can take their iris print from a long way away. There was actually news released yesterday about an attack on an iris print system where a photo could be used. They cut out the photo, they put it on a contact lens, put it on somebody's lens, they could get through that biometric system. Okay, it's kind of scary. How hard is it? I mean, you read about this stuff and you go, well, you know, it's got to be hard, right? I mean, it's got to be something that you need really clever people who really have too much time on their hands and really just want to get into the press, so I'm not so concerned. It's a good question. So we posed ourselves that question. And what we did is we got a bunch of people who were clever people but had no experience in biometrics. We put them in a room for about 10 hours. It was over 2 days, but about 10 hours. We gave them expensive, extensive equipment. And we said, you know what? See if you can make fake fingerprints. 10 hours. Off you go. Don't bother coming back. You're sacked if you can't do it. You know, no pressure, no pressure. Actually very easy is the answer to that question. Surprisingly easy. You take the photo, digitize the photo, create an inverse of the photo, panel it up. For those of you who've worked in embedded stuff, panel is a PCB panel. When you make a PCB, you put it in a panel. So you panel it up so you get lots of them. And then you etch it on a PCB. Once it's etched, you put down some silicon, let the silicon set, and voila, you have a fake finger. Less than 10 hours from here is what I want you to do with no experience, no knowledge, no prior study to being able to do it. Once again, I've got your fingerprints right here, so I will be asking for phones at the end of the talk. So how does that look? Does it work? Now the next slide, once again, the projector doesn't like me. It will flash a little bit. I'll jump past that flash to the actual video. Video is pretty quick, so I'm just warning you now before the flash that, you know, it comes up. There we go, fake finger, common phone, opens the phone. Now we tried this on multiple phones. We tried this on multiple computer systems. We tried this on some systems we know are used in banking in certain locations around the world. Opened all of them, no problem. Some easier, some harder, some advertised with liveness detection, some not advertised with liveness detection. All of them could be bypassed by this within 10 hours, no experience, just clever people. So what about other biometrics? What else? Well, we gave another team, this was essentially a hackathon we ran, gave another team a task of, here are some facial and iris recognition systems that we're going to get you to hack into. Once again, 2 days, about 10 hours. Turned out they actually did everything they needed to do in 2 hours, and the extra 8 hours they just kind of played ping pong or something, not really sure what they did. Once again, pretty simple. This is a video, a phone with a video of somebody's face, a system that claims liveness detection because you have to blink, and it opens it up. A little bit scary. I mentioned at the start, I'm actually a proponent of biometrics, so don't take this as me saying biometrics are bad. Take this as me saying you have to know what you're doing, what your threat environment is when you're utilizing biometrics. If you're talking to vendors and they say, oh, trust us, we've got a great equal error rate. We've got a great liveness detection system. Ask for validation. Now, the problem is very little standardization in this area because it's difficult to standardize, but that's something that's being worked on now. So, are biometrics better than passwords? Well, depends where you're coming from. Depends what you're doing. Ultimately, as I mentioned, passwords were dead to begin with. But importantly, you have to remember, your biometric data was public to begin with. You leave your DNA everywhere you go. You leave your odor everywhere you go, at least if you're like me, you do. You leave your fingerprints on those glasses that you're drinking from. Your iris pattern is in every photo that is taken of you. It's out there. So you need to make sure that the biometric system that you're using isn't a single factor, because it's essentially useless as a single factor. It needs to be coupled with something else. I'm happy opening my phone with my fingerprint because it's my fingerprint and my phone, and because my particular threat model assumes nobody cares enough about me to steal my fingerprints and my phone. Depends who you are. There may be people in the audience who are more important than I am. Okay, let me change that. There are certainly people in the audience who are more important than I am. Your threat models could be different. So what is your threat profile? What is your threat model? Are passwords good enough? List of commonly used passwords. Unfortunately, corporate requires me to blot out certain words. I'm sure your imagination can replace those words. But these are commonly used passwords, and everybody uses them. Now, passwords were dead to begin with because as human beings, we're not very good at them. If we have the ability to create a great password and we use that password, that's fantastic. If a password is cryptographically strong, or at least not brute forceable, that's fantastic. However, if it's not, if it's a poor password, if you can brute force it, if you can download it offline and you can attack it with some sort of password hacker, then that's a problem. However, There are scenarios where passwords are a lot better than biometrics, even a simple password. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the San Bernardino thing. In this particular scenario, there was almost a fight between certain sections of the US government and Apple, because Apple wouldn't let them hack into iOS, or at least wouldn't assist them, let's put it that way, in hacking into iOS to open that phone. If that phone had been opened with the criminal's fingerprint, they wouldn't have had to ask for that assistance. They could have just got the fingerprint off the body, created a fake finger, opened it up. Once again, 10 hours, you could probably just get the police to do it themselves without the FBI. So there are certain situations where passwords are better. But why is it better? Why is it better in that particular scenario? Because there are protections against domain brute forcing. Although it's a short password, you can only enter it a certain number of times before you're completely blocked. I'm sure all of us here have bank cards with pins on them. A PIN number is just generally 4 digits. You do have banks that issue 6. The actual standard allows you up to a 12-digit PIN number. Never met anybody who actually has one of those. Let's say commonly 4 digits. You can brute force that pretty easy. 10,000 different numbers. I actually have a slide on a different presentation where I list the world's worst payment data breach. And what I've got on that slide is everybody's PIN, all 10,000 different numbers, because you can list them. It's very simple. I know what your PIN is. I've got a slide with your PIN on it. But it's of no value to me because I can't match it up to the payment card data, and because I can only enter it incorrectly 3 times before the back end stops me. So domain brute force protection is important. We need to think about that for biometric systems as well. But you know what? Passwords are also a problem because we're finding increasing ways to gain access to them. You can figure out a password on a phone by reading Wi-Fi signal strength data at the router, because as you type that number into your phone, you interfere with the field, with the signal that is being transferred from that phone to the router, and from that you can actually determine where the finger is in relation to the screen. As long as you know what the phone is, as long as you've got some, good stuff. This was done in a lab environment, but it actually was done. You know what? Maybe Wi-Fi, it's too hard. How about gyroscopes? You can do the same thing with gyroscope on a phone. You can do the same thing essentially with sound from a keyboard. You can do the same thing using the front-facing camera on a phone. You can probably do the same thing with a camera on a laptop. Passwords are broken. Biometrics, also broken. But we need to understand what those breaks are and mitigate them. No security is perfect. We need to make sure we're not maintaining something that is broken, waiting for something that is perfect. Because you know what? That perfect is never going to come around. So, biometrics then, we've got what you know, what you are, what you have. But we can enhance this. We can make these systems better by adding more data. We talked about big data and how it can be used against you. It can be used for you as well. You can take information about where you are. If you use your biometric in one location, there is a fixed period of time at which you can't be somewhere else within a given distance. That information is really important. You can take your history, what you've done in the past, how you've used your biometric data, where you've used your biometric data. That's also important and can lead to what's generally referred to as multimodal authentication. You can escalate, or risk-based authentication. You can escalate the authentication if it's a particular risky thing that is being done at the moment. Maybe biometric, your fingerprint, is okay for some actions. You want to do something else, a little bit more risky, we take into account more things. What you can do, your gait, your movement. Okay, if I'm talking about these, how many, there's not that many gait monitoring systems, gait being, the way you walk. But you have phones that have accelerometers on, and they can tell what you're doing. You have trackers, which have accelerometers on, and heart rate sensors, and can tell what you're doing. One of the slides I took out of this was something from my fitness tracker. If you got access to my Fitbit page, you would not only be able to tell when I was at work, because you'd see that I rode to work, I rode a bicycle to work every day. You'd be able to tell just from the data whether I was riding by myself or riding with somebody else. When I'm riding with somebody else, I ride a little bit slower. My heart rate's lower. You'd be able to take that information, in fact, see when my heart rate goes down, and figure out generally where I live based on where I stop at traffic lights. Now, this sounds kind of advanced and science fiction-y. Perfectly possible. Perfectly possible. So all of this, though, is not to say that biometrics is bad. I, for one, welcome our biometric overlords. However, we do need to understand how we're going to use them and what the problems are. We need to mitigate against those problems, same as we do with any other system. There are some caveats. We need to take those templates, we need to store those templates in a very secure location. The first, biometric fingerprint sensors on phones, on Android, I'm going to say it, were pretty bad, to be honest. They were not stored within a TE or a security module, and they were very accessible. There was a problem. Now, a lot of vendors, in my experience, will tell you that templates can't be reversed. Once you've taken a fingerprint template, that template isn't nately secure, can't be reversed into a fingerprint. It can. Research shows that it can. Actually not that difficult. Don't use biometrics as a single factor. Use it as one of multiple factors. Take the fingerprint, the iris pattern, the facial recognition, the way you walk, the way you smell, the way you act, your DNA, whatever it is, and then pair it with something else. What you have, what you know, multiple factors. Your identity is not an authentication of intent. And a biometric gives you identity. But in computer land, we're using that identity as an indication of intent. I want to unlock my phone. I want to pay for this purchase. I want to unlock my computer. I want to get into this room. But we're basing that decision on understanding something about somebody, identifying a person. We need to identify intent to perform an action. We need to validate vendor assertions and promises. Don't just accept what people say to you. Seems obvious, but it's generally the way things go. Random password with domain brute force is generally going to be better. Or threat profile, threat profile, threat profile. If you're the leader of the US, I wouldn't suggest that you base your nuclear launch codes just on your fingerprint, because there's going to be many, many photos of you holding your finger up, many photos of your eyes, probably people who've captured your DNA. However, if you're Joe Blow off the street, maybe it's not that bad. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone has any. I can, if you want to be louder, I can run the mic to you, or I can just repeat the question if anyone has anything.
There we go, question there. You can just yell at me.
Who's doing it best at the moment?
Could everyone hear? The question was, who's
Who's doing it best, biometrics best? At the moment, all systems, to be honest, are not great. Fingerprint sensors, the resolution is generally around about 600 dpi, 600 by 300 dpi. There are new sensors coming out that are like 4 times that. I'm hoping they will be better, although I haven't tested any myself. So I think at the moment, nobody's doing it well, but I'm hoping it will get better.
What do you think about the Microsoft facial recognition, Windows Hello?
I think it's perfectly attackable. Ultimately, it's a gimmick, to be honest with you. And you know, most facial recognition systems at the moment are attackable. Now, if you wanted to use it for crowd control, for recognizing people, that sort of thing, if you understand the limitations, sure. For using it as your primary source of unlocking your computer, I would not personally recommend it. Anybody else?
Last chance. I think we're good. So thank you very much. Another round of applause, please, for Andrew. That was excellent. And I have this token of appreciation from AusCERT.
Thank you.
I don't know how I feel about my fingerprints being on this.
That's okay.
But
That's
please
okay.
enjoy. So thanks everyone for coming out. The next session will start in about 5 minutes, and it's going to be Nigel Fair.